evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are delighted to be welcoming you here at the Liechtenstein Institute with the History of Art and the Institute of National Heritage for this evening, organized in collaboration with ICOM France. As you know, these are regular meetings that we have in this amphitheatre, which we then broadcast online. And we prepare these jointly. We aim to focus on topics that are currently facing professionals in the museum environment. This evening, we thought that it would be interesting to go back to heritage and the memory of slavery and how to exhibit collections related to this history. We thought this would be relevant, and relevant again, I should say, because INP has some history in this field. In the past 10 years, it has been grappling with these questions. I have started to see in early 2000s this topic appearing in museums. I'm sure we'll have more precise details about this later on this evening, but it's interesting to analyze what we have done with IMP. There are some publications on the topic, but in 2015 there was also a symposium on the heritage creation associated with slavery and colonialism. In 2019, there was a publication related to the repatriation of artwork, a conference as well on the memory of slavery and archaeology in 2021. And we had a rapid succession of events after this with an exhibition, Le Modèle Noir, as it was called, and a study day with contrasting viewpoints on this topic. And you may have noticed that this topic is something that continues to raise interest and remains fresh. I think it's important to ensure that we continue to work with these networks who have spread and continue to promote sharing in the academic circles, but also in museum circles. I believe that things are much smoother now between European visions, American visions, African visions. In any case, there is now experience sharing that is quite regular, which did not exist previously in the same proportions in any case. We can also see that we're raising new questions. An article was published a few days ago where we were thinking about the critical viewpoint that we can have on colonialism. We're taking colonial objects now as an object of study, and we're entering into a new phase. I think a few years have passed since museums have really taken ownership of this new academic subject. We're seeing universities and museums now exchanging on this topic. There has been a lot of experience in museums because we often talk about this in museums, and we talk about how to exhibit collections that are related to this and how to mainstream this to our audiences. Thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you for faithfully attending these evenings. Some of you attend regularly, and others are new in our panel this evening. Thank you so much for your hard work. Thank you for the ICOM teams. You're very efficient, and I hope that we will have lots of opportunities. And thank you for Emilie, my colleague at INP, who has helped organize this evening. I wish you all an excellent evening. Thank you, Charles Personnaz, for welcoming us into this beautiful auditorium. Thank you to IMP and Emilie Maume in particular, and Séverine Blenner-Michel. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are here for our third evening debate of the year. And thank you for faithfully attending. We are going to be talking about a topic that we mentioned with Dominique Taffin a few months ago. We thought that it would be great to have a topic like this in May. We were able to talk about this with ICOM France members, and we thought that it would be good to extend this topic and talk about different ways of addressing the topic. Charles Personnaz has already said that around 20 years ago, this topic became prevalent in museums. This is not that long ago, considering the long history of museums. Museums were undoubtedly the first to take an interest in this subject and to make it a core concern of their establishments. Let me continue with the example of the modèle noir that was cited earlier. Museums are no longer the only ones to offer their visitors dedicated tours, permanent galleries, temporary exhibitions, mediation and cultural programs, fine art museums and contemporary art venues, whose collections or the sites that house them are sometimes linked to the memory of slavery. And they are also taking up the subject. Although the subject of slavery is a recent one in the history of our museums, as I said, but it is now being tackled in a variety of ways. And I believe that this is a response to society's high expectations in this area. How do different types of museums with different scientific, cultural projects, approaches, and resources respond to the issues raised by the exhibition of collections relating to the history of slavery? Dealing with the question of slavery in museums means tackling a wide range of issues, rereading collections, plurality, legitimacy, and recognize of expertise, defining the subject in all its complexity, whether chronological and geographical scope, strategies for appropriate, sensitive, or renewed mediation, the role of artists and activists, and many other topics. How are museums tackling these issues today, and what proposals are they implementing? How can they contribute using their own resources to creating new narratives that avoid cliches? At a time when the French Ministry of Culture is working on the development of contested heritage, when the issue of the decolonization of museums, collections, and the way our institutions operate is at the heart of discussions among professionals in France and overseas. And I would like to thank Hanna Pennock, who will be talking about work carried out in ICOM on decolonization. And when the issue of human rights is increasingly present in our professional exchanges, this evening is an opportunity for professionals to share their experiences and thoughts on this fundamental issue, which today concerns a wide range of museum types. Thank you to all our speakers, online and in person, for sharing their thoughts with us. And thank you to Nathalie Bondil, who will be moderating the evening. This meeting was prepared thanks to reflections of ICOM France's scientific committee, who met. And for this event, Coralie de Souza Vernet joined them and will be wrapping up the evening alongside Dominique Taffin. Thank you to all of you. I would like to finish with a few thank yous. So thank you to our translators who translate into English, French, and Spanish, and Ms. Schwartz and Mr. Michel, who will be taking notes throughout the evening so that we can publish very quickly. And finally, as you know, all our events would not be possible without the work of those who make ICOM France tick behind the scenes. We've got Anne-Claude Maurice, Alexia Maquinet, and Camilla Scianchi. And I wish you all a very pleasant and profitable evening. Thank you so much, dear students, dear colleagues, dear participants. I am delighted for the opportunity to be moderating this panel discussion. I'm going to try to launch my PowerPoint presentation now. Tech support, please. I'm afraid I'm not able to launch my PowerPoint presentation. Unfortunately, we do have a few technical difficulties this evening. I apologize. Thank you so much to tech support for coming to help. So let's start by talking about this topic that is the theme for this evening, heritage and the memory of slavery. There is no neutrality when it comes to slavery. My apologies, we had prepared everything correctly, but unfortunately we're having to adapt this evening. So Mr. Guisson said that we have a collision of worlds and talks about the abyss, and this is a name of an exhibition that is in Nantes. So cultural heritage and museums cannot remain neutral on the topic of slavery. The topic of enslaved peoples is part of our history. This is not the history of others. This is our own history. And this is why this work is going to continue for a long time. I must say that through everything that I have learned through my career and recently, I must say that it is a topic that has a lot of hope associated with it because younger generations, with the support of experts and museum professionals, are making progress on this topic. So we are going to be focusing this evening on thinking about slavery, not as a historiographical and economic study topic or memorial topic. We're trying to take the topic and give voice to people who were enslaved. How can we embody these people? How can we pay tribute to their past? So we have a deferred power in this case. We have needed a lot of research, and I would like to insist on work that has been done in archaeology and archiving and museology in order to know and recognize what has happened. André Delpuech, who is here today, I would like to welcome him here. We're talking about giving voice and face to these people who have since passed, and we have needed a lot of excavations and archaeological digs in order to discover objects that are sometimes very modest. It's another vision on heritage. We're not talking about the fine arts. We're talking we're not talking about temples or artworks. We're talking about a different kind of history, but these artworks are very important and we need to treat them equally. Here, there is an example with this book called Archaeology of Colonial Slavery, which is based in Guadeloupe, Sainte Marguerite, which has a lot of memorials because there were plantations, and so there are now public statues. Exhibiting in order to embody these people has a difficulty because these people have not had a voice or a body, so we need to give them a face again, give them voice again. This is something that we've been able to do in the scenography of Tromelin, L'île aux esclaves oubliés, which was at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris in 2019. The objects found on this island of Tromelin, this was a tragic story, and it shows the resilience of the slaves who lived on this sandy island for 15 years. There's a lot of pictures. We'll be talking about mediation And the aim here is to embody, this is another scenographic strategy which was used in an exhibition called L'Abîme, Nantes in the Atlantic Treaty and Colonial Slavery. Here you can see a sea projected on the walls. This is similar, like you can see here on the left-hand side, where the names of these people are projected so that we do not forget them. We also want to be recognized. These people want to be recognized. I thank Webster, who mentioned an exhibition in 23 at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Some slaves signed their work, wrote poems, and were able to embody themselves through creation. We have an example of Dave Drake, Dave the Potter, who as a slave created enormous jars on which he wrote poems and signed his name. Sometimes he even signed Dave Drake, once known. So currently there is a lot of interest in American museums for all these craftsmen who had been enslaved. Their works are sought after and collected in the largest institutions in the US. Sometimes they're sold for huge sums. But as they say, nothing goes back to the descendants of these great artists. The question of slavery, or people who were placed in a situation of enslavement, raises a question of decolonization of our lexology. The N word, as we say, is one that is no longer acceptable. We are also moving away from talking about slaves to talking about people who have been enslaved. There's a new way of formulating this, and we need to be sharing this with the public. A number of publications have appeared recently. The bibliography is very active in recent years on this topic. Here, I would like to mention a publication that I have just received from Métis Lab, which is a museological reflection platform. It's really quite remarkable. I recommend that you view this. There are different interviews and stories, indexes, and bibliographies that allow museum professionals to discuss this topic. There is a new book that's just been released, Réunir les bouts, art, histoire, esclavage en mémoire du monde, connecting the dots, art, history, slavery in memory of the world. So it's about how we can activate this memory. We're not looking just for remembrance, but activation of memory. And then Hanna, Lucia Arrojo, and Klara Boyer-Rossol and Myriam Cotias have released Esclavage, Représentation Visuelle, Slavery, Visual Representations. We're delighted to be able to read this. It's great for museum professionals, curators, and the public to be able to work on this topic. We're not just talking about site museums and history museums. All museums are affected by this question. When you are in a fine arts museum, in Montreal, for instance, where I was able to work, there is artwork such as this portrait, which is presumed to be from the Francoville family. On one side, there is a young man who is most likely a slave. We recognize him through his silver collar. There is a possibility of working on stereotypes as well, because when talking about the history of slavery, we need to bear in mind that we're talking about racism with this portrait of Julie Moss, a Canadian artist. This is a series called Lily and Scott in the series called Domestics on servants, and has carried out a series of stereotypes, work on stereotypes. And then a series on secondary figures that we see in art history in our collections. Here there is the Comtesse du Barry by Gauthier d'Agoty, which is in Versailles, or also we have this painting by Marion Sims, gynecological surgeon. We can see a change that is helping to decenter perspectives and pay attention to other aspects in paintings and works of art. Talking and telling other stories is also very important. This is linked to resistance, to acts of heroism by men and women. I encourage you to see an exhibition, Résistante contre l'esclavage, which has been supported by the Foundation for the Memory of Slavery. This is available in train stations in France and museums have also in the Louvre, for instance, opened an exhibition on Oser la Liberté about the descendants of slaves, and then Ni chaîne, ni maître, no chains, no masters. This is a new film that has been released in France. This is one of the rare films on the history of slavery in the Mascarene in the Mascarene Islands, which is part of France's history of slavery. We need to be opening up to other societies and other forms of slavery in other geographical areas. We're going to be talking about the First Nations with Webster later. Here you can see a scene by a Tanzanian painter, which is presented at a historical museum of Villeyel. These are wall paintings where we can see the markets of people coming from Zanzibar. And on the right-hand side, you can see a similar image, which is displayed in the National Museum of Nairobi. Young men and women were sold with prices and contracts like real slaves. There are trials at the moment, modern day trials on this. We have been working with some Yazidi women who have suffered this terrible oppression during ISIS in Iraq, and they have been able to share their names and use a sort of art therapy to draw pictures to tell their stories. I encourage you to view this platform. This has been supported by Google Arts and Culture, the United Nations, and the World Health Organization. They're able to exist through their voices, through their names. So we're making progress, but there's also one step forward and one step back. So Brazil has recently decided to commemorate events in order to educate the community and tell stories of what has happened, with national days on the 20th of November. But also there have been racist texts that some Americans have received on the day of the election of Donald Trump. And I'm sorry, I needed to show you that as well. So also there are other artists continuing to do justice by being fair. Here, this is a really incredible documentary, Forgotten Eritrean Refugees. Sinawi Medine, who created a documentary on these slaves that are in a really terrifying situation at the moment. They're sold, mistreated, tortured, and forgotten. It is so important to remind ourselves that this issue of slavery is still very much prevalent today. Sometimes we see it in prevalent neighborhoods with people serving richer people. I am now going to hand over to my next speakers that will after I've presented a bit of an overview of this topic, I would like to welcome Mohamed Oualdi, who should be with us somewhere in Florence. So Mohamed Oualdi, who is Professor of 19th and 20th century European and North African history, and he is at the European University Institute in Italy. Mohamed will be talking about an exhibition that he has proposed with two co-curators that we'll have at the Institute of the Arab World in 2026. Mohamed is a specialist on the matter of Muslim slaves. Mohamed, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is that okay? I can see, I don't know if Nathalie can hear me. We can't hear you very loudly. Okay, yeah, that's better. That sounds better. Great. Well, thank you for your invitation. I work with Nathalie at the Arab World Institute in Paris. We're working on an exhibition that we're expecting to be called that Muslim Slaves in Enlightenment Europe. And we're also working on an exhibition which we hope will come to light in 2026. So before going into the exhibition, so we're limited here to 10 minutes just to keep you from getting tired out by us. So before just talking about the exhibition, I just wanted to explain the circumstances of the exhibition and the collaboration which led to this exhibition project. So if I could have the next slide. Thank you. Perhaps as we just wait for the next slide, I'm in Tunis actually at the moment. I'm being seconded by Sciences Po in Paris, who are contributing to this exhibition with legal results, and I am glad that I have left this institution because it's not allowing its students to protest about genocide. So here, this is an exhibition I'm working on with these art historians, Meredith Martin and Gillian Weiss, who published a very important book called The Sun King at Sea, on the way in which in the maritime arts at the time of Louis XIV, they used slaves as models. And there's also a figure of a slave which clearly appeared in boats, in sculptures, and also in this kind of belligerent attitude of Louis XIV. And so if I could have the next slide. They wanted to work on this because they contributed with a number of different historians to thinking about the role of slaves in France at the time. And you can see this painting here of this street in Marseille in 1720 during the plague. And if you zoom in, but you can see this in the Fine Arts Museum in Marseille, because what's really very clear is that there are slaves here who were responsible for picking up the bodies of people who died from the plague in 1720 in Marseille. And so this work around art and violence, which is a classical question in the history of art, how is violence and physical domination, how does this create art and even fine art? As far as I'm concerned, I have been working on this subject in a different way than my colleagues, and that's why we can talk about a complementary approach. As a classic historian, I have been working in the book that you can see on the book on the left. I've been working on slaves from the Caucasus and how they were used in the Ottoman Empire from the 16th to the end of the 17th century. And then I've also been thinking about slavery in the Muslim world through all the groups that were involved. And so The project that I presented to the European Research Council is a project that's currently ongoing around the purpose of slavery in the Mediterranean. The ERC, the European Research Council, is not a very well-known institution, but is really very important in social and human science research today, and also in hard sciences, because it makes it possible to fund innovative projects. And the whole exhibition planned in the Institute of the Arab World is being funded by this project that I'm leading with the ERC. And you can see how this institution and the European Union can be a place that's open to innovation. And so through this map, and this is the second point that I want to develop on this project with you, is that this is a region that you don't know so well, because thank God we better know about slavery and the transatlantic trade, but you can actually see that there is a diversity of men and women that were enslaved, trafficked, and deported. And so the goal of this exhibition, even though it's focused in on Mediterranean slavery, takes into account a whole series of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish slaves with black skin and also light skin, with this whole variety of Mediterranean slavery. And just for all of our colleagues who are not specialized in this question, it's important to make a distinction between slaves deported from West Africa to the north of Africa, to the center of the Ottoman Empire, and sometimes also to the ports of Mediterranean Europe. It's good to make a distinction between them and those who were enslaved during the Mediterranean Wars, where we talk a lot about captives. These men and women and children who were taken captive in the Mediterranean had to pay a ransom, and there's a difference between these groups. So once we've set this context, the objective of my work is to understand the purpose of slavery in the Mediterranean through the letters and petitions that these slaves wrote in the Mediterranean. What's interesting to me is the northern part of the Mediterranean, so Muslim and Jewish slaves, and sometimes from West Africa, that we could find in European ports. Perhaps we could come back to the previous slide. Why am I focusing on this area? Well, it's because there is an innovative aspect here. For decades, we have been working on European slaves in the north of Africa and other areas because they have left us some writings, and also because a sense of Catholic redemption that was expressed here. But actually, it's important for us to show to a broad audience. And actually, the exhibition is going to be free of charge because of the funding from Europe. And what we want to do is to help a broad audience to get to know the situation, even though we'll be talking about Christian slaves in the north of Africa, but we'll be mainly focusing in on Muslim and Jewish slaves from North Africa and also West Africa in Mediterranean Europe. Once again, this is a choice, but as Nathalie Bondil has very clearly said, there's a lot of work still to be done, both in Western Africa, Northern Africa, and also with slaves in Europe. And what I wanted to add in about the birth of this exhibition, if we move on to the next slide, is that through the presence of the co-organizers, Meredith Martin published an article on slavery in museums, which was published in English and French. Here's the French version that you've got mentioned here, and she really insists on the fact that since the exhibitions in 2019, the goal has been really to expand the narrative and think critically about art, and particularly about the suffering of men and women who've been enslaved, give another meaning, to help audiences to think critically about the art rather than simply admiring it, as we heard in the introduction from Nathalie Bondil. So in terms of the exhibition, the focus is going to be on slavery in the Mediterranean, which is less well known than the Atlantic slave trade, with museums, the museum in Nantes and other museums. But this here we're talking about another kind of slavery with different levels of violence, a different level of slavery than with the transatlantic slave trade. But what we're trying to show is that the Enlightenment Europe was a Europe that contained slaves, slaves that could come from across the Atlantic, but also from the Mediterranean. So a Europe free of slavery did not exist even after the French Revolution at the beginning of the 19th century. And what we wanted to do was to show that their presence fed into a kind of daily art. So what you can see here is a statue in the city of Livourne, which is almost a symbol of the city of Livourne today, which presents one of the Medici dukes. And at his feet are 4 slaves. These are Moorish slaves, and this term Moorish means black, but also Muslim. And what you can see next to this is that this model of the 4 Moors has led to this question of slavery in Enlightenment Europe. We could also talk about the other aspects associated with Napoleon, which show the figure of the black slave and also the Turkish slave. One of the other focuses of this exhibition is going to be not just to show how slaves are used in art, but in the next slide, how they actually created in Enlightenment Europe their own art. And so here's some examples here, because I'm not going to show you everything. I want there to be some surprises when you come and see the exhibition, and also by superstition, even though there's a very strong legal agreement between Sciences Po and the IMA. But I want to show that slaves, just wanted to show the slaves' own experience. So first of all, there's a letter here, and we can see the addressees of the letter, and you can see the line with circles and squares. This represents a slave chain, and in Arabic we can read the description of the chain to which some Muslim slaves were chained. It's a letter from this period, from the 17th century. And then the other thing that I want to show you very quickly, we can't say everything in 10 minutes, but the second type of document that you can see in this final slide is a talisman, which was seized by the Maltese Inquisition and is kept at the Museum of the Inquisition in Malta. It was seized by a man of a Christian origin who became a Muslim, so he was called a renegade. He was a former slave who converted to Islam and was seized by the Order of Malta and was arrested and interrogated. He had this very long talisman, which was 2 meters long and showed another type of artistic production in Europe. I don't know if there's another slide. But what I also wanted to say is that the exhibition itself is a classically organized exhibition where we want to bring the spectators into a deeper knowledge of slavery, of Jews, of Christians, of Muslims in Europe, while introducing them to the the context of slavery in the Mediterranean, and finishing off with an epilogue which shows how the story came to an end at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, and how it continued to impact the 19th century with the little known story of the presence of slaves and freed black men and women in European Mediterranean and also in the colonized North Africa. So without giving you everything that the exhibition talks about, it's also about there's a whole series of forms of different sorts of slavery to be shown through artistic production and through the very productions and art and works of captive men and women. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Mohammed. So you can see that there's still a lot of research that we can do on the archives, which are really very impressive. And you will also be seeing this now with the next speaker, who is Klara Boyer-Rossol. Klara is a historian, researcher, and curator of the Visages d'Ancêtres exhibition, which I recommend you go and see at the Musée du Château in Blois. And they have worked together with the Intercontinental Slavery Museum in Port-Louis in Mauritius. So, which is going to talk about the history of, she's going to be talking about the history of slavery here in this area and focusing in on restitution. And we've got a whole cycle of archives taking us up to restitution. It's really very unusual. So can I use the PowerPoint? So first of all, I just really want to thank ICOM France for this invitation, and also the Foundation for the Memory of Slavery, who's a partner of this event. So I work in particularly on the East African diaspora issued from the slave trade, which was dispersed in the Western Indian Ocean islands. And for the last 6 years, I've been doing research work around a collection of busts, which is the Fleuberville collection. Everything started in October 2018. I was able to get together the original works thanks to help from my colleague, and I really want to thank my colleague because it really would have been impossible without him. And I was really stupefied to discover the majority of the original collections in the reserves, as you can see here in front of you. So this original collection was collected in 1846 in Mauritius by the French Mauritian ethnographer Eugène Huet de Froberville as part of an ethnological study on Eastern Africa. In 1846, this was 10 years after the abolition of slavery in Mauritius. But it was in the context still of very important domination, in particular, since the majority of individuals who were molded were men who had been deported to Mauritius in captivity, and most of them had been slaves. But at the time where they were molded by Froberville, where the molds were made, they'd already been set free, most of them. And some of them had arrived on the island after the abolition, and they had a hybrid status as hired workers, but that were not free to return to their homes. So that's just to give you a very crude summary. So the collection had 63 molds, including a number of copies, and this made for 58 individuals and only one woman. So this collection clearly represented the characteristics of these East African slaves that was primarily made up of men and for working in sugarcane plantations. So this collection was really very important in the 19th century. It was one of the most important collections of busts outside Africa. And in the 1870s, the Museum of Natural History in Paris made copies. And actually now we've got more copies and overmolds that have been made than the originals. In Blois, there are just 53 busts that are left, but in the Paris Museum, we have all of the model, all the copies, and it's actually in this museum that I was able to do an inventory of the missing bust, and therefore I was able to find the woman who was missing, because the original collection didn't have the woman in it. I hope that's clear. So this collection was completely forgotten in the 20th century. It was kept throughout his life by Eugène de Froberville. This is a photograph from the 1900s of him in his library. He kept this original collection and all of the manuscripts of extraordinary archives that were not accessible to researchers. And so I had this amazing opportunity to find the original collection in October 2018 after accessing the archives, which were being held by a private individual in the southeast of France. And so I have been doing 5 years of research on this collection, which is now being held by one of the museum, because the private individual was convinced by my research of the precious nature of their collections, and they donated it to the museum. And so this will be accessible in just a few days, and between now and 2025 the archives will also be open up to the general public. So this is really about shedding light on a collection which has been in stores and in private archives and not been accessible to researchers. So bringing together these busts that had inscriptions on them with the handwritten notebooks of the original researcher, I've been able to put together the stories of these individuals. So these individuals were providing information to Proboville for his study. And so he did 18 months of research, and I have managed to identify 140 individuals, 135 of whom are in Mauritius. I was able to identify different information about their life with different levels of detail, but these archives from the notebooks were really very detailed, and I was able to identify these people. And of these 135 in Mauritius, I have been able to identify 56 out of the 58 individuals who had their heads molded, and that's really an amazing result. And I really have been able to do this thanks to these amazing private archives. So my historical research work involved researching the production context in a post-abolition and also colonial condition, in a situation of domination. So we're able to also identify the circulation of the original busts and also the reproduction of these busts in France. and the change of in museum techniques around this collection. This research project has also led to a museographical project, an exhibition project, which involved an initial digital exhibition in Mauritius, in Port-Louis. It's a recent museum at the Museum of Intercontinental Slavery, and it's a working together between the Château Royal Museum in Blois and this other institution. And so the work has really been to bring voices together with images in plaster who've been able to whom we've been able to give names, and the origins of these people have been able to be uncovered. Sometimes we've managed to find the precise location of their birth, their forced travel, even from places distant from the East African coast, and then their forced journey across the sea to arrive in Mauritius. I've been able to look at the period of these journeys aligned with the precise information that I had. And so I've done a lot of detailed work over 5 years, worked on the origins of these collections associated with the history of slavery and colonization. This has taken a lot of time. And of course, as you can imagine, the whole goal was to reincarnate these faces, to consider them as individuals, to be really have a very different approach than the original ethnographer, because the collection was designed to present the race, in inverted commas, of continental Africa, which was really hierarchized here. And what I wanted to do was go and meet and encounter the individuals who were generally former captives who'd been slaves in Mauritius. So this exhibition was done through photos and through videos. We did 3D recordings in Blois of these busts, and this was put together with the ISM. I did produce the narrative, and so the ISM asked me. We have got 12 different videos for 12 busts out of 53 original busts, and the rest of the collection was presented as photographs. The ISM, which is the Intercontinental Slave Museum, they asked me, which I wasn't sure about this, but they asked me to do this, to recount the narrative in the first person. I wasn't sure about that as a historian, but actually in the end I found it a really very interesting exercise. And when, after having been written in the first person, they were translated into Mauritian Creole, and they were connected into the descendants of these people. So I've been collaborating and dialoguing with these people, with these descendants of freed Africans deported from Mozambique. Today's Mozambique in 1840, and they were initially deported by a ship which from Brazil and was supposed to be going to Brazil, but it was intercepted by a British patrol, and the captives who survived were transferred to a British ship called Lily, and they were not returned to Africa, but they were taken to the colony of Mauritius so that they could be hired workers in Mauritius. And so they were listed and registered with names, sometimes with slave names, which just shows these ongoing practices after the abolition of slavery. So they were given the surname of Lily because it was the ship, the name of the ship. And so they were freed hired workers that were all together. And this name of Lily was given them as a surname. And still now there are in France and in Mauritius families who have this surname Lily that I was able to meet and dialogue with. And some of them made it possible for me to record their voice, and they were able to recite these experiences of the people that they consider as their ancestors. They may not be their biological ancestors, but people that experience the same traumatic conditions that they experience, the same journey across the sea. So this first exhibition, which was launched exactly a year ago on the 1st of September 2023, you can see on the photograph on the top left this huge poster which was still there at the Museum of Slavery, because this is a permanent exhibition. There are tourists and Mauritians that go and see this, and so in Mauritius these busts can be shown, these huge posters. There's really no issue with this because they have a relationship with this collection which is different. These are the faces of their ancestors in the historical sense. Their ancestors as enslaved Africans. But actually we have very little iconography from African slaves in themselves. They were generally anonymized. We don't know their faces, we don't know who they are, but here for the Creole communities in general, this is a very powerful testimony, because these are not sculptures or representations. These are the actual, the marks of their ancestors. But nevertheless, the question of exhibition is different in France.
This exhibition currently at Château du Blois is the first time that we have presented a historical and exhaustive version of this. This is going to travel to Mauritius. It's not a restitution, it's a traveling exhibition. We thought it would be great to exhibit this in France before returning this to Mauritius. In France and in Europe more generally, we have a very different relationship with these kinds of anthropological 19th century busts. It's linked to the history of races as well. A lot of these busts are in Europe, in the Netherlands. They're often in reserves, in storerooms. They're not often exhibited, or they're exhibited as a witness of science, but actually they're a witness of history, of colonization. And this, what convinced me to exhibit is the dialogue that we had with the descendants, to have re-individualized, named busts. We have built music that have been passed down as well. And we have reconstituted this in partnership with the National Conservatory of Mauritius. This music has been digitalized. You'll be able to hear it in the videos. It made sense to do this working with descendants, not just in Mauritius, but also in France. It's important to bear in mind that it also affects French people today, not just Mauritius people from Mauritius. So this is a temporary exhibition until the 1st of December. The collection, which you can see here, you can see that there is a video which has been used and then integrated into our exhibition for the Château Royal de Blois. We have worked with the collaboration at the heart of everything we do. And the Lily descendants were involved in the exhibition, and they have also added their testimonies. On the 12th of October, they attended a panel discussion organized by the Fondation pour la Mémoire de l'Esclavage, Foundation for the Memory of Slavery. It was really emotional day, actually, and I really do encourage you to visit the Château de Blois in order to experience this exhibition yourselves. As I said, this exhibition, but yes, the busts are going to be returned to Mauritius 200 years after their production. This is going to lead to what we call heritage cooperation, with training by Delphine Bienvenue, who is here today. Thank you for being here. And she is a specialist curator in plaster moldings and will be sharing this adventure with us. She has already worked on the restoration of around 12 busts and is continuing this work. It's historic, and there will be an initial transfer of 3 busts tomorrow in Mauritius. And we'll be working with the Mauritius Foundation for the Memory of Slavery. This is the first step, and the next step will be the transfer of the entire original collection, hopefully in August 2025. Here there is the exhibition catalogue, which is out of stock, but we hope that we will be able to produce a second edition, because these really are the imprints of ancestors. These are original moldings. Sometimes there is hair that's being captured within the mold, so there's actual DNA in this. And so experts have been taking photos, experts in human remains, to show all of the different dimensions of this collection. They do not consist of human remains, but they do contain organic matter. Ancestors have breathed within these molds. They have left behind part of themselves. For descendants, they may be considered relics, therefore. Thank you. Thank you very much. As you can see, it really is extraordinary to imagine this collection that has been able to identify descendants. These anthropological collections were presented in Musée differently, and here we have a real embodiment of these people. But obviously, this is a huge amount of work for archaeologists, for historians, for archivists. So it requires a huge amount of support, and we will be coming back to this topic. We are now going to head over to the other side of the Atlantic. We'll be joining Webster. I'm delighted to have Webster with us here today, based in Quebec, who is a hip-hop artist and also an independent historian, who was curator and designer of the exhibition Fugitifs, that was awarded a prize of excellence. He will be showing a different face of fugitives, showing them as heroes who were able to escape from slavery. Webster will be describing this project, which could come to France or elsewhere. Thank you, Webster, and welcome. I'm really happy to see you again. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for welcoming me here in ICOM. My name is Aly Ndiaye, alias Webster, and I am a hip hop artist and independent historian. I am going to tell you the story behind how I chose to do Fugitives, this exhibition. I was always fascinated by history, and at the University Laval in Quebec, I studied this. Never in my studies did I hear about slavery in Quebec. Nobody mentioned an African presence in Quebec, which has been there since 1629. And Quebec City was founded in 1608, and from 1629 in the New France region, there was Olivier Lejeune and other African descendants. So one's from West Africa as well. And these people arrived as people who had been enslaved. So this was the first decade of existence of New France, where there were already African people and enslaved people. When I was at university, I stumbled across this information quite by accident. And I really tried to find as much out about this history as possible. Books have been written on the topic, but not many. I took everything that I could, but it was not sufficient to just have information on this history. I wanted to share it so that everybody could better know this history and the African and Afro-descendant population in Quebec and Canada for 300, 400 years. And 395 years this year. There's a plural history and much less uniform history than we had imagined. This has an impact on our past, but also on our future. The only medium of communication that I had at that time was rap, so I started rapping about this history. But rapping about this story meant that I was only reaching an audience of people interested in rap. My objective was to be able to reach everybody. This was epistemological work, if you like. So I started doing conferences and guided tours of Quebec, of African and Afro-descendant history in Quebec. I did podcasts and also an exhibition. This exhibition was designed in order to increase awareness of the history of slavery in Quebec because it's not very well known. There's a negation that has worked. Initially, historians started to write the history of Quebec and Canada in the 19th century, and it started with a denial. The father of science in Quebec, as we call him, when he wrote that our ancestors didn't have slaves in order to preserve the integrity of their blood. So we began by denying this history, and it worked. We were able to negate this history. It has been excluded from national narratives in both Canada and Quebec. My objective was to raise awareness of this history and to make it more accessible because, as I said, books do exist on this topic, but these books are very academic. They're important, but they don't build bridges to the general public. For me, the struggle is about this conceptualization. Academic research is very important, but sometimes we struggle to facilitate access to the general public so that this research can be rooted in this population and better contribute to social change, if you like. So it's this conceptualization that I was seeking to build between the academic world and the world of publishing and the general public. If we can move forward onto the next slide, please. Before talking about the exhibition, I would like to tell you a bit about the form of slavery in Quebec. We're very familiar with plantation slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. As Oualdi said, there are, of course, other forms of slavery. When we think about the word slavery, we think about the transatlantic slave trade, which was between West Africa and the US and the cotton plantations, there are not cotton plantations in Canada because it's not possible with the climate. This was generally slavery in urban environments. In domestic environments, this was either slaves who were kept at home or slaves who came from the US through the French regime. So we have the French regime and then the English regime that was from the 1700s onward. In the French regime, most people in slavery were indigenous peoples. New France was far away, and the seas were only could only be navigated for part of the year. French colonizers connected to the indigenous slave networks and were working with the American Midwest with people that were called Pawnees. They were captured by Pawnees, and this term was used for enslaved indigenous people regardless of where they were from. They were called Pawnees. On the left-hand side, you can see an advert for a Pawnee boy who was around 17 years old, remarkable, sober, very healthy and stout. Slaves were sold in the marketplace, in auctions. But with the British conquest, we had the written press that arrived, which was in 1764 in William Brown in Quebec. And from then onwards, the press was available and people were able to be advertised in the press. And here we saw a huge increase in African and Afro-descendants' lives due to loyalists to the British regime who had settled in Canada. This tendency was reversed. There were two types of adverts in the second half of the 18th century: to be sold, or alternatively runaways, which you'll see in this next slide. There were adverts when slaves ran away because people wanted to find them. We describe what they look like and also any intellectual traits. In Quebec, we did not have any iconographic objects. It would be a whole different conference to describe what we had, but we did not really have iconographic works about slavery. I started thinking about that. There's no images, but we do have descriptions. And I was able to use these descriptions in order to illustrate these people and to give a human face to people who were dehumanized by slavery, in order to celebrate resistance as well. When we talk about slavery, we do need to talk about resistance to slavery. They were not just victims of an oppressive system, but they fought it every day or right up until the revolution. I wanted to show you some examples of these adverts. These adverts are really rich in information. On the top left, you can see someone called Isaac, sometimes goes by the name of Charles. He speaks all right English, a little bit of French, and Mi'kmaq, which is a language that many slaves spoke due to the experiences that they had because of the two regimes that were one after the other. So it was a kind of mix of French and English. So if you can move forward to the next slide now, I'm going to show some people here. We have Nemo and Cash, which was announced on the 4th these names are interesting. When we see the names of people in slavery, it gives us an idea of whether they were in a Catholic or a Protestant family. In French Catholic families, rules stated that they couldn't have a pagan name like Diane, for instance. It had to be a name from the New Testament, such as an apostle's name. These restrictions were not in place for the English-based Protestants. So we find names from mythology or history, Caesars, Plato. In French as well, we can have unusual names like Louis XIV, Versailles, Sans Pistole. This is the costa that the person, and we often had Nemo in English, and this means nobody in Latin. These people are nobody in the social ladder. They're nobody. And cash, I wanted to see if there were any other meanings of the word cash in the 18th century, but it would appear that it's literally just referring to money, to cash. So Nemo, who apparently has a round and full face, a little pockmarked, which means that they've survived, whether they've had measles, for instance. That was an added value because it meant that they were already immunized. And this is announced when they run away because this illness leaves a trace. It becomes a characteristic in order to help find these people. So we hear that they speak English and French, and we hear that they're wearing a double-breasted jacket of flannel, stockings, and English shoes. And we also hear that she's taken with her a large bundle of wearing apparel. This is a strategy that we often find with women. They leave with a lot of different clothes in order to change their appearance because their appearance is described in the newspapers. This means that they are able to flee more easily. So if we move on to the next slide now, we can see the illustrator Valmo, who gave an idea of what these people might look like. You can see the pock-marked face that's very round. And you can see the stockings and the shoes, the double-breasted jacket, and then Cash, who had fleed with a lot of different linens. The next person I would like to talk about is Andre, who is called a mulatto. This is a term that comes from slavery in order to refer to somebody who had one white and one black parent. This comes from the word mule, which mulatto. It's almost the equivalent of the word mule. So Andre speaks English, French, a little Dutch, and Scottish language, and is supposed to have with him forged certificates of his freedom and passports. So he had actually created fake documents in order to facilitate his escape. So often in these adverts, we heard words such as is supposed to have. So we're alerting people here as well to the supposed forged certificates. So Andre, apparently 5 years previously, had gone to the courts to try to prove his freedom, but it had been refused because he was not able to prove it. So there are fake passports and forged certificates of freedom. So if you can change to the next slide as well. This is an example of what Andre may have looked like, which was drawn by illustrator Casendo. There is linen around his head, which links very much to the Caribbean and West Africa. So let's move on to the next slide. I've already gone over time. I'll try to move through these a little bit more quickly, but if we can skip forward a little bit. Here you can see Joe, who was born in Africa who was owned by William Brown. And Joe is unique because this is the 5th time that his escape has been announced in a newspaper. So let's move forward and we can see the next slides. This is Robin, Lydia, and Jane. This is the final advert for runaway slaves in Quebec. This is from 1798. And slavery was banned in Quebec in early 1800s, which was a few years before the UK and the French bans. The official date of abolition was the 1st of January 1830, but because there wasn't much slavery, it was starting to decline from the early 1800s. There were very few people who remained enslaved for the 1833-1834 emancipation. So if we can move forward now, I just wanted to show you the form of the exhibition. This is an exhibition that I wanted to keep very simple so that everybody could find their way around. I wanted to avoid too much text. You can see a description, you can see Andre, you can see the advert in the newspaper, a transcription of that ad, and the character. There are QR codes now in the exhibition, which means that visitors are able to use their telephones in order to get more information about all of the characters and the historical context. The first time that this exhibition was at the National Quebec Fine Arts Museum in 2019, you can see that there were a lot of contrasting portraits at the time. You have the very dark colors of the people who owned slaves, and around them these colorful figures, and you can see their entire bodies, and these people are symbols of resistance. This meant that we could center the narrative on these people and not just as tools by the oppressors. We were able to show how these people were able to resist by showing their human faces. Even if this is in a context of domestic slavery here, there was resistance to slavery. So thank you very much for listening. I'm not going to take any more time. Webster, are there any more slides? Well, let's just go through them. So we've got the exhibition, which has also gone through high schools as well. Yes, it's a traveling exhibition that goes to universities, high schools, museums, exhibition venues. There's an online tool as well in order to show the chronology of slavery, and a collaboration on the rights, on human rights. Where there is a teaching guide so that teachers can find out more information and do exercises with young people in their classes linked to this history. Thank you so much, Webster. It's really inspiring as always. Congratulations. Brilliant. All these strategies in order to give a face and a voice to these names. It's really inspiring, and I hope that we will be able to adapt them and import them to our own museums. Time is flying because we started a little late. We would like to leave some time for questions, but I would really like to make the most of having Dominique Taffin with us, who you know very well. He's an archivist. She's an archivist and curator, former director of the Fondation pour la Mémoire de l'Esclavage, is currently head of contested heritage at the French Ministry of Culture. And we're awaiting this report with bated breath. So Dominique really does have a lot of experience on this topic and will be... Oh, I'm sorry, I've skipped Hanna.
No, sorry. Are you here?
Shall I start then? Thank you, Nathalie. Yes. Yes, I see that. Okay, I won't take too much time. I'll do my best. And so, you want to introduce? Yes. Yeah. So, I'm the Hanna Pennock. I'm the co-chair of the ICOM working group on decolonization, together with Ozuebo Shinedu Ishola from Nigeria. We have a group of 10 persons and 10 members and 4 members from the executive board and 2 persons from the ICOM secretariat who are a great support for us. We were installed last summer, and in the conference on Dubai, we will present our report, which will be filled with recommendations to ICOM how to deal with decolonization of museums and how ICOM itself can decolonize itself as an organization. I speak here about decolonization, and the topic here is slavery, but of course, slavery and colonial history are very closely connected. So, and you will hear that in my presentation. We saw a few other portraits that Webster showed right now. I wanted to show you a few examples of the collection that we keep at my work at the Cultural Heritage Agency of the Netherlands, because they are quite good examples of objects that are closely connected to colonial history and slavery. And very often we don't know anymore what we keep in our collections. Like this portrait here, it would be like an 18th century portrait of a man, and we know his name, but actually during the time we have forgotten that this person had a role in colonial history. He lived for 20 years in the Dutch Indies and was deeply involved in the occupation, let's call it like that, of Java in this case. And if we go to the next slide, there's another example that many of us in the next slide. Please, yeah. There are many portraits like this, which often have a person next to the person who is being portrayed. And very often that person is not mentioned at all. And in our case, we have a collection of 120,000 objects, mainly Dutch art and applied art. And if you want to search a collection to know what you have, you won't find this usually in the art historical description in your database. This specific portrait had already some description, and I highlighted in white what it says about the black person here on the right. So a boy in white, red striped coat and a silver collar. And of course, this collar was a slave collar. And the next one, the next slide, shows another example of objects. The next slide, please. Objects that we keep in collections in our museums and that are always described just in a technical art historical way. In this case, sugar casters of the early 18th century. But the sugar that was used in these sugar casters came directly from the plantations, and thus it is directly linked to slave work. And one part of decolonization, the collections, means going into these descriptions, adding new narratives, cleaning the description, taking out derogatory or offensive words, and open it up to new narrative and new stories. Next slide, please. The next slide, yeah. So in general, if we talk about what did the museums collect in a colonial context, or collect is maybe a very weird word actually here. So the context was where did the objects come from and how? They were taken in a military context, in wars or in so-called punitive expeditions. They were taken by missionaries or scientists or colonial rulers, or they might have been gifts from local rulers to the government. And you might wonder how equal this situation was. Was this a free gift, or was this to obtain certain advantages? Also, colonial employees took objects home or sent them home, and tourists, we would call them now tourists or travelers, many traders, and also artists were interested in these objects, and they usually bought them here in Europe in the international markets. So very often these objects were taken in unequal situations, sometimes even in a one-sided military law as an instrument to take them. And then they came into our museums where they were neutralized. The collections were neutralized and just showed as interesting objects of how do these people live there, not mentioning the other part of the story. I always like to mention that it's not only looted art or stolen art. There also was a lot of work made for the market, like this mask of Papua New Guinea, which came into our collection with the bequest of an artist. And this was made in the 1950s. So it's not always original what is in our museums, and it's not always taken in an unequal situation. So if you go to the next slide. Next slide, please. In general, we speak very much about loss. Loss then, but also loss now, as I showed, the loss of knowledge of objects that are our cultural belongings that are in the museum collections. But if we talk in general, these options were taken in a context of the loss of lives, of freedom of rights, the loss of family and community structures, the loss of identity and languages, culture, practices and traditions, and the loss of religion, also the connection with ancestors, and the loss of knowledge, indigenous, traditional knowledge, or coming with that, the knowledge of nature, of ecosystems, of botanical and medicinal knowledge, the loss of land, history, and also the loss of objects or cultural belongings, sacred objects, and also human or ancestral remains. And that resulted then and now in a loss of self-esteem and the loss of pride. Like our colleague in the working group, Asma Ibrahim from Pakistan, said, we still have the feeling we are nothing. That is what was told to us by the British rulers, and it means now that we still have to adapt, change our mindset, and we have to get rid of this feeling. And in general, what we see still is systemic racism and the consequences of violence and trauma. If we go to the next slide, please, the next slide. How can we repair that, and what can museums do in this case to help repair these losses? So there are many ways, and I just want to mention a few. It's about indigenization, or going back to the ancestors, to work with communities and reconnect with lost culture, practices, and languages. Show respect for nature again, discover again traditional ecological knowledge, ask for consent, and respect cultural rights of people who are living there now. That means dismantling colonial legacies, correcting, repairing historical injustice and systemic racism. So actually, in general, it means getting rid of colonial structures. And this can be done especially by museums, by the recognition of injustice, reconciliation, and healing. And museums should do that with an eye on the mental health and well-being of representatives of communities visiting their exhibitions and visiting their storages, but also for the museum staff who are confronted with specific types of objects or who have to work with people from communities. So, as I mentioned already, it's about undoing what colonialism did to the mindset of the colonized and that feeling of we are nothing, and the need to restore pride and self-esteem. So that means coming to terms with the past, and that is a global thing. It's both in the global north and the south and all over the world. To conclude, in my next slide, what can museums do? So one way, and that's been spoken a lot about, is restitution, or you might call it repatriation or rematriation or just return. Just one example here from the Netherlands, where 288 objects were returned this October to Indonesia, and that was just that was a second part, and the third part will still follow. And then we have the last slide. The next slide, please. What does it mean? What does decolonization of museums mean? And so what will be in our report to ICOM? The conclusion is, in any case, the concept of decolonizing museums means different things in different parts of the world. Or very short, it depends on who you are and where you are. So for museums, which are a colonial structure in themselves, it means working in democratic curatorship, co-curating, building new relationships, exchange knowledge, reaching out to younger generations, and reviewing itself as an institute, reviewing the collections, and rewriting the existing narratives. And actually, this works two ways. Communities can find back their history and identity in museum collections, and the museum can reinterpret its collections with different knowledge systems and new partnerships. So for museums, we need new scenarios, new models, and multiple ways. In the end, maybe a museum could be changed into a community museum or just a house of stories. And well, just to make it clear, decolonization is not a tick box or a checklist. It's a long process. It's a transformation. We have to be patient and respect the time it takes. And this is the work for museums to be done and for ICOM to communicate with their museums and their members. Thank you. It's important. Yes, definitely. And we shouldn't forget. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay then, so Dominique. So everyone knows Dominique. I've already introduced her. And now, Dominique, over to you to talk to us about the change of perspective through public space. So I hope this is going to work okay. I've got the PowerPoint here on the computer here. Can we get the slide up? Great, thank you very much. Sorry, just a few technical issues here we're trying to sort out. So thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. Just before getting right in, I want to just say, yes, there have been a number of scientific events around the question of history associated with slavery. I'd also like to mention, I think, the first French symposium that was in 2011 at the Quai Branly Museum on exhibiting slavery. And unfortunately, it's required a lot more time for professionals really to start focusing in on this question of slavery and colonization. And we've been seeing an acceleration over recent years with the exhibition in Nantes, in Le Havre, en Fleurs last year, and then other initiatives which have perhaps made less noise outside of Paris, but I think these really need to be followed and tracked what's going on there. So there's been a lot of really interesting presentations this evening from Webster and Klara on exhibitions that they have presented, which really present this question of the individual representation of people. I just want to try and remind us that we need to keep this broad perspective when we're a professional and we want to get involved in this. We need to have a broad geographical perspective and also a broad time perspective in terms of approaches to slavery, because the different ways in which things are presented links into what was happening in the time, and the representations and the narratives that are developed by exhibitions are of course linked into the significance and the meaning communicated in public space. So if you know this subject, you might be a bit disappointed by what I'm about to present, but I want to talk about this memorial approach on the basis of the models put in place by Joanne Michel, a sociologist who published a work entitled Becoming Slaves, and he talked about three memorial approaches: the abolitionist approach, the anti-colonialist approach, and the victim approach would be perhaps the approach that we're more focused on here. But really I want to underline the dynamics across these different regimes. So we're going to see this today, and everything we're doing in heritage contributes to getting these memorial practices together and this museum work together with the work of contemporary artists. All of this helps us to realize the complexity of the situation we're in. And first of all, I really want to insist on a very important point, because often we forget this, because there's the geographical and diachronical aspect. And there are a number of different times in the world, and here in France, which has overseas territories in the French Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, and elsewhere in French Guyana, and we have had independent things going on in Africa and elsewhere, and I think it's important always to understand where we are. And I just wanted to restate that the memorial of slavery has been structured differently here and the other side of the sea. And of course, where here is and where the other side of the sea is going to depend on where you are right now. So at least in terms of the Caribbean or in Reunion, the question of slavery is really present in social relationships. It's an incorporated memory, as is mentioned by one of my colleagues. And so with this approach of Victor Schellscher, who was the abolitionist, the key player in the decree of abolition in 1848, and Schellscher is perceived as someone who stood for equality in the colonies, and this is what we called Schulcherism. So this figure was really picked up by the colonial and colonialist republic, and this creates a great narrative of the dominant republic setting people free as opposed to the monarchy, which was a regime that had a kind of responsibility for slavery. This regime is what I knew as a child. We celebrated in Guadeloupe the Schellsche Saint's Day, Saint Victor, and as a child I knew that there was slavery because I knew that it had been abolished, but I didn't know a lot more than that, really. So you can see that this structured society, and this went on to the 1970s. It was Schellsche that pushed for there to be an abolition in 1848. And so there is truth to this, but it's not the whole truth. There's the lies through emission. We can see statues of Schellsche everywhere. In Guadeloupe, we celebrate the revolution and the rights, the human rights. So here we've got some example of Schellsche by Barriès in Cayenne, Schellsche in Fort-de-France before it was destroyed, in front of the Palais de Justice. And next to this, because there's this paternalistic iconography that you can find everywhere. I've then got the Emancipation Monument in Washington, which represents Lincoln with a slave really at his feet. And this links into the category of populations and focusing on research. I also just want to remember Jacques Adélie de Merland, who was a Guadeloupean historian who has just died and really had a French language Caribbean historiography. And this is, of course, a writer who's not very well known here. But this emergence of this new model, this new paradigm, was part of anti-colonial activism, an autonomist approach. And heroes are mentioned, but they're local heroes. They're heroes that are represented in their territories. So people that historians highlight that are clearly mentioned. And then we have the figure of Neg Mayon, the slave who's breaking the slaves, that you can see in a whole number of different municipalities. In Martinique, we can see this. I'll be talking more about Martinique now to compare in with what's going on in mainland France. I think there's less in Reunion because that's another whole story, but at least in the Caribbean, this is the case. We have Delgrès, we have Solitude, we have Toussaint, and then for Haiti with Romain from the revolution there. And here's just a sample of these different figures. So this work from 1971 from Coco René Corail. This is quite early actually, with Delgrès, and then the recent statue of Delgrès, which was produced in Paris in 2022. And when I arrived in France, I realized that actually even the little I knew, people knew even less than I knew. It was really ignored, and sits from 1998, perhaps 1989, but 1998 really, with the 150th anniversary, it was picked up, but it was still a peripheral knowledge. We have commemorations from 1983, but this was only for the overseas departments. There wasn't this notion of a national memory, but at the same time, the movement of people and information was intense between mainland France and these territories on the other side of the sea. And this activated a law which was which connected into the Taubira law, which led to what we started to see in Nantes, for example, this dual narrative of the Republic, which was obsolete, and the battles and the resistance. And there's this attempt to put in place resistance, and you can see the memorial put in place in Nantes in 2012. And all of this just removes visual representations. It's just text, and you just hear words as well spoken during the visit, so that there's a kind of polyphony of voices of people that have fought against slavery and have revisited the notion of abolitionists, because abolitionists are not white Europeans in the center who are thinking against slavery, but it's also these people in all these different territories and all around the world in the way that the memorial is presented here. So you can see these two memories, and you can see what's going on here, and you can see this focus on liberty and human rights. But in public space, there are nevertheless colonial traces that are not really questioned, and it's going to require more time for it really to enter into public debate. I won't really go into this in detail because I think everyone followed what happened and what's been happening since 2020 with the protests and the actions which have led to the destruction, fairly radical, with the statue of Josephine, who already had her head cut from 1991, but now it's been totally destroyed. And this is not the case for the Cayenne statue, which was damaged when it was pulled down, and there's a reflection being carried out at the moment about what was going to be done. And so then there's this question from 1998 of how we can honor the victims of slavery, and this question is also about how we can talk from the point of view of the people who experienced it, the people that were enslaved. We need to focus attention on them, and this is inspired from another model associated with traumatic history, of course, the Holocaust, and the memorials and the presentation of victims. So this takes us into something that is a bit different, but it also leads to change, because all these victims are an undifferentiated mass of people. So we've got the memorial here in honor of captives that lost their lives in a shipwreck, just off where the statues are. So they're white in the color of mourning in Africa, and they're focused on where the ship was coming in Benin Bay. So there's this idea of victims, but this paradigm also has limits because it leads to making these people passive and anonymous. They're just victims. So being a slave isn't a condition, and being a victim is also a kind of a condition, and it becomes a bit of an issue as well. And so a number of different initiatives came to light which have another focus, but which generally have in common the desire to find the individuals, to do research on sources and list the names of people. So this is a worldwide work. So here's some example of work that's being done. There are associations working on this. There's an association working in Guadeloupe, but also in Martinique, and the same thing in Réunion in French Guiana. And so the idea is to prevent this movement that focuses on just anonymizing people in slavery and to help them become individuals, and also to get out of this victim paradigm. So this might not be the only way of doing it. There's this approach of having name walls or things like that. This has been done in French Guiana. It's not perhaps the most beautiful thing, but here's an example that I found in Charlesville. I won't go into the details because I haven't got very much time, but there's also been work done which has been different. There's one of the associations is trying to help people who are living today to find a connection with an ancestor. So this is the person, perhaps we find a link to someone who was freed in 1848, which is not, of course, the case for everybody, because some people were freed at other times. Not everyone was freed in 1848. This is an enormous amount of work, and there's also this work of making this presence of slaves visible in France. Mohammed earlier talked to us about the fact that there were people in slavery in France in the 17th and in the 18th centuries and at the beginning of the 19th century. And this is the production of the Wall of Names that was done in 2021.
Another approach is going to be about individualization without heroization, looking at the story of their lives. In museums, we have biographical information like Webster presented earlier in order to tell the stories of people who have been clearly identified. Here is an example of a relatively long plate in an exhibition. I'm sorry for the poor quality of the screen here, but this exhibition was from 2020 at Rijksmuseum Amsterdam, and it told the story of people associated with objects. Professionals are being forced to ask themselves the question about what objects they can choose. Will they tell stories based on objects or based on information? It's not necessarily very easy to show, as it's quite dispersed information. And I think that this debate remains open. And I think that Coralie will mention this later on as well. Finally, I would like to present two final points before wrapping up. It's about reflection around research, historical work that's being carried out by the new generation of historians, micro-historical approaches that seek to retrace an experience. And museums are able to use their museographic skills in order to produce this. I think there's something that we can learn here, but a lot of people have been telling me that we need to go further. I've presented two examples here that are different, but they have something in common. It's about a relationship with self in the present. We heard about descendants of Lily. It's not necessarily biological descendancy. It may be. Here there is a presentation by Emmanuel Gall, who has written a book thinking about his entire family tree. It started out as perhaps an identity project because they were lacking information on their own family. But she's actually discovered a lot of questions that are raised. And these are the same questions that historians trying to understand colonial past and slavery have to be asking themselves. I think it's quite interesting to look at genealogy, not to fix something or set something in stone, but actually to add complexity. And so that's why there were all these beautiful people with a system. And there's a little brown post-it next to him, which are questions. Why did they do this? Why did they do that? And what did this person do? How did they become a colonial administrator, for instance? On the other side of the screen, you see an example from Martinique. This is an example where there has been a modification of the meaning of heritage. After there was a funeral site that was subject to an archaeological dig. It's in a place called Alcebele, which is in on the coast, and human remains were found along with some other objects. There has been a mobilization from residents who formed a collective so that these human remains were not treated the same way as other archaeological remains that were stored. There was a scientific investigation on the bones in order to learn what we can from what we discover in archaeological digs, because this is very important. But what's really interesting is that their perspective is that these remains are what make them who they are as a community, and they want to be able to care and they want to be able to repair it. They have written dignity, respect, honor, respect for them. That's what you can see written on the tombstone. We are retaking ownership here and becoming actors in the story. So it's really interesting in this evolution of memory from people in slavery who become actors, even though they're in a real struggle, a sort of resistance. Which may or may not be visible. It's also through forms of adaptation in the context of domination in which they are. There's also this question of taking back power, that today people are trying to take back their power in these situations. I'd like to conclude with reflection that Raphael Barantini's work inspired. This is an exhibition called We Could Be Heroes, which was held last year in parallel with the exhibition of the Fondation pour la Mémoire pour l'Esclavage called Liberty. It was interesting because here there was iconography and performance with a kind of hybrid approach. These heroes, some may be recognized in the images. He created collages of images. You can see part of an artist's picture here. Some of them may not be able to be identified or may not be so well known, but there was a desire to blend in a hero history for the 60s and 70s with a sort of cultural resistance, including in the carnival-esque performance, which was organized in the Pantheon a few times throughout the exhibition. So thank you so much for listening. I just wanted to say that remembering and creating a heritage from slavery is something that we're still doing. I think that it can have an impact on how we're reconfiguring our memory at the moment. This work is carried out in workshops, and the foundation has been working on this. I wanted to show you this photo because we do need networks like this foundation. There's a museum of slavery in France, which is the museum of reference, in order to coordinate this kind of network. And there's a real need for that. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm handing over to Coralie de Souza-Vernet, who is Head of Heritage and Research at the Fondation pour la Mémoire de l'Esclavage, Foundation for the Remembrance of Slavery. So over to you. Thank you so much, Dominique, for this overview that you have given. And I think that you've really presented the historical evolution of what's happened and what has already been done. We should not forget that currently we have such rich work that's built on less visible work by a lot of people. It was perhaps less celebrated in venues at INP, for instance, but people have been working on this for many years. So I would like to start with this slide, and it goes back to what has been said previously. There's a lot in heritage, not just in modest heritage. This is the Hôtel de la Marine, and these are now the offices for the remembrance of the history of slavery. This is why it's because the abolition document was signed in 1848. It's a central location, and it was also a location that was the base for administration of the colonies. It's to remind ourselves that we want to be present in these places of power. Dominique has been talking about this. You can see in this presentation in the Salon d'Angle at the Hôtel de la Marine. This is part of the visitor exhibition route. It's open to visitors. You can see this dyed tapestry of New Indias, Peinture des Nouvelles Indes. Visitors have a headset for an audio visit, but it does not mention what this tapestry represents. So the foundation has now offered a unique guide, which is based on slavery. Here in the background of this picture in the center, there is a view of a sugarcane plantation. These histories sometimes need to be spoken again. They are present in our heritage locations. In the Louvre Museum, Dominique showed earlier the story of sugarcane plantations. This is beautiful work. The database work at the Louvre is also really interesting. This is an object that we often use when speaking. So perhaps we can just type slave into the database at the Louvre, as there is a sugarcane on their backs. But if we just type the word slave, this piece of work will not show up because it is not part of the title. So this is why it's so important to be showing these anthropological molds and so many other things. This question of what appears is very significant when we're thinking about cultural heritage. For those who are young here, those who are less young, we all have a role in opening up perspectives around these objects. Let me come back to this question of titles now. In a National Fine Arts Museum, it's important to think about titles. Thank you, Nathalie, for the photo of the Basile from the Montpellier Fabrel Museum. I've not confirmed with colleagues whether this new double titles are yet in place, but there are a lot of paintings. This is the first time that we had this portrait of a Black woman who was called Madeleine. I think that the question of titles is a really important question associated with art history. The life of the work includes the life of the artist, and the title is not fixed. We have this tendency to perhaps fix the question, but if we go back in time, we can rework on these titles. We do have this freedom to express ourselves and to think about today, because the titles have changed in the past and they're not as set in stone as we may have thought that they are. Let me come back now to my first slide. We've talked about the periphery and memories that are sometimes forgotten or left to just a few affected people. At the foundation, we believe that this is a shared. Here we can see that there's a real ability to move from one side to the other, and the foundation is really defending this kind of work. It's a European question. We need to, when there was the development of this colonial system, and there's a discourse that needs to be had at a state level. It's really interesting to see what's happening in Switzerland at the moment. Beyond this, there's a reflection about what's happening in public space. So we saw this, there's one in the Zurich National Museum. I've added some texts because they're going all the way back to the 16th century. We often think of the second colonization when we see this kind of hat, but when thinking about colonialism, they've really connected the issues of first and second waves of colonialization. It's really interesting because in this exhibition, they specify that they're going to be opening the door to discussion. Anna Pennock was talking about care and attention to visitors and members of the team. Opening dialogue is a really interesting possibility. In Geneva, there is another interesting exhibition, Memory, in the wave of colonialism. This is a very interesting exhibition. It's been curated from a number of points of view with a plurality of presentation methods through artistic interventions, podcasts, historical research, memorials. It's through this plurality, and we've been talking about decolonialization, and we need to perhaps have more democratic curatorship to see how different people are able to speak. These are interesting methods to study. Today, we've seen this through the diversity of projects that have been presented. I think that all organizations depend on this project. We've had spaces of encounter between heritage workers and curators, different institutions. Mohamed was talking earlier about dialogue with art history researchers, interdisciplinary work, and I think it's important to be asking these questions about encounter so that we can have these multiple perspectives. To wrap up, at the foundation, we're working through this network of heritage institutions that launched in 2019. Dominique has organized 2 really interesting events, and I encourage you to check that out on our site. We want to have this foundation in order to share best practice. and realize together that we have dispersed elements of this history. We need to bring it together in order to tell a comprehensive narrative. There's also the question of having a framework. These questions are sometimes complex, so a different context. Dominique was talking about contested heritage. There's a lot of questions about current contexts and tensions. Coming together gives us a space for experience sharing and a kind of forum where we can co-design projects and make sure that they have the most not that they're attracting as many people as possible. Thank you very much for your attention. Allow me to hand back over to Dominique and Nathalie now. Thank you. Thank you so much, and you have so much patience. It really was worth listening to you, and it's worth listening to you as well. Emilie is telling me that we may have a little bit of time left for perhaps one question. I know listeners wanted to ask a question. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Good evening, everybody. I just wanted to quickly say something about Haiti in order to inform you of an important event in conservation and preservation of heritage. You all know the disaster that the country is going through at the moment. I lived in Haiti for a very long time, and I'm especially attached to this country. That's why I'm talking to you today. We are currently faced with a heritage disaster. It had already suffered from degradations over the past 3 decades. We are not able to work in the Haitian countryside, to work in archaeological ruins. We can no longer go and visit them. There are gangs that are controlling circulation. Unfortunately, we're not able to go there. It is now forbidden by our French president even to get involved in Haiti. So the disaster that we've just had recently is that the fund that was called after me, named after me, Fond Jacques de Sona, who asked me to provide photos that I'd taken over 15 years in campaigns, which was a lot of work, and there are 2,800 photos that have been digitized, and 350 of them were exhibited on the CIREX website for around 10 years. I am going to contact you just afterwards to try and understand your request, because today we're trying to really focus in on our seminar on slavery, and I think that other people would perhaps like to ask some questions. Yes, let me wrap up very quickly then. This site meant that anybody could access very quickly to any neighborhood in Haiti, in places where the majority of slaves lived and worked every day, because in Haiti there were slaves before. It's no longer possible. I've been a member of the scientific committee of this foundation right from the start. This fund has now disappeared, and there's a real loss. And so we need to be funding work on inventory with Haiti. It's not possible to work with this. There's been a loss. It's been lost in cyberspace. So I'm just asking for your support in maintaining Haitian heritage. We'd be delighted. So we are going to put you in contact with a specialist just after this meeting. Thank you so much. And come to the Louvre on the 11th of December, as there's going to be a special event on French relations with Haitian culture. Congratulations, Hanna, for your 5 years of research on the traces of ancestors. I've worked on photographs in Benin in 1930. I tried to put a name to some photographed faces, but the result was not great. I wanted to know more about your methods of researching these ancestors through the molds. Yes, there were some photographic sources that I used of original busts that are now at the Quai Branly, but the sources I worked on were mainly written, and I analyzed the busts materially, comparing different sources. Once again, most of them were written. And I was able to piece together the history over time. This is a database that I fed into over many years. It was a work of reconstitution. Looking at the start of their trajectory, for instance, it took a few years. So I would encourage you to go to the Iconothèque, the iconographic library of Quai Branly, as there has been excellent work on the identification of photographs from the colonial period. And an exhibition has been focused in on this topic with a number of examples where they talk about this. This really is very interesting work. There's one question in the room, perhaps. The interpreter apologizes, but there's no sound. Good evening. My name is Eva. I am a first-year student at Natural History Institution, and I'd like to ask a question about collections that Pauline Maurice was talking about. Why is there no restitution, and why is this only considered to be a return? There's not been a request for restitution. From the offset, we were in collaborative work right from the start. The idea of returning the busts arose very quickly as the Musée du Château Blois was very open to this question. That is why ultimately there was already this initial openness about returning. There wasn't a request for restitution. This is owned by the city of Blois. So this is public heritage in France. It's a national museum, the Château de Blois. So having to declassify them from public heritage is something that we don't have yet. There's not a framework, a legal framework for cultural objects being restitution of cultural objects. There is for human remains. It would have been a lot longer to go down this route. So here, this project has been quite quick. Research has been very long, but the results were extraordinary. In 2 years, from a museographic perspective, it does move very quickly. And this is going to be a renewable period of 5 years that these objects are going to be sent there. They're going to be transferred to Mauritius to remain there. That's what we are hoping for. That's why we have associated a training program with this, so that the Intercontinental Museum of Slavery can become the guardians and also the caretakers of these collections.
Thank you very much. Is there another question? Yes, sir. On the first row there. Good evening. Thank you for this just amazing event. I'm Sylvain. I don't represent an institution. I'm here as a private individual. So I've got a number of really naive questions. The title, Heritage and the Memory of Slavery, why is it not in the plural? Maybe there's a good reason. And the second question would be, how do you get the people that have this heritage to come to you, the people or the families? I come from the French Caribbean, so I know there, but how do you get contact with families who have this heritage that you could study? How do you encourage people to provide their heritage? I think we're going to hand over to Dominique Taffin here, because this is a question she's an expert in, because yes, there is a real issue there in terms of sources associated with private origin that are associated with slavery. Because of course, administrative sources, despite the fact that historians can really dig deep, they don't manage to really document as much as we would like these stories. And so really this is about long-term work. There have been movements focused on archives. I don't know if you knew what happened in 2006, for example, when archives were sold, and this has made it possible for archives, rather than going from between private individuals, have been able to be welcomed and hosted by a public institution. So this is a question of property law in France. Really the issue today is to help people to change their thinking so that the people that have these archives are obviously in some difficulty, because if it's family archives, of course, in some ways they are maybe kind of linked and tied into it, even though if they're not responsible, they might be a bit sensitive about this. And this is long-term work. I was leading the departmental archives in Martinique for a number of years. This is long-term work, and Klara, that did this work for the collection and was really the go-between for this magnificent collection to be given to the archives overseas. It's a really brilliant example. We really have to present examples like that. I don't know if the foundation would also do that. I think the foundation is thinking about that, but the goal is to work with a kind of communication campaign to tell people you've got things and you want to contribute to this work of repair in society. We're not going to be saying who's guilty, who's responsible. We're saying you've got things that you can contribute to heritage, and how we're going to get them out of the private status and put them in the public domain. And I think there's something to be done there. We also tried with sales, but that was really difficult. Also, we could talk about a project that you led when you were leader of the foundation, and in collaboration with the archives and the UNESCO memorial is the promoting of archives that are already in the public domain. It helps to raise awareness of the wealth of archives, and families might not think about this because the story that we've heard from Blois and Klara's research is an example, perhaps the richest example in the French colonial domain of something linked to slavery. So these collections with this miracle, really, because we've lost a lot of plaster molds. So, of course, having this collection with a whole number of different plaster molds and this very rich work, because there was some very precise work that was carried out, and perhaps this other kind of rich collection might exist somewhere else. And I think therefore it's about changing mentality, like Dominique's saying. Perhaps just to conclude, in terms of what would be good from the perspective of ICOM, is that it would be good to have a basis, a list, which could be a place for these objects to be identified, where the countries and the origins don't necessarily know about this yet, or they don't really have the opportunity yet, or they're not perhaps yet there yet in terms of their study and of their request. And that would be an interesting project that ICOM could work on, Emilie. Of course, Emilie, that would be for you, of course, working with ICOM International, of course. Can I just have another question? Would there be in Paris or in mainland France, but particularly in Paris, is there a memorial? We've talked about Nantes, but in Paris, there's going to be a memorial that's going to be inaugurated in May 2026 at the Trocadero, connected into work that's being done with 1848, to remember 1848. The goal is for there to be all the names of the people listed in 1848. So this is a national memorial. And so this is currently in progress, and this should be a national memorial that should be inaugurated on the 23rd of May 2026. But you're also right, just to conclude, this national memory should be enshrined in national museums like the Louvre, but it's not yet perhaps fully the case. And there is a big exhibition that should be held in national museums, and it should be led by the major institutions. I can see my colleague here in front of me, because this is a subject that is really worth being summarized, because there's been so much exceptional work that's been carried out by historians and researchers who are sort of really passionate about this and working on small projects. But this can't just be in Le Havre, in Nantes, in Bordeaux. This is really something that needs to come, because this is the history of France. And so with that, I think that's an excellent place to stop, really. So I wish you a very wonderful evening.